different approaches. So I'm going to frame it as loss, meaning loss of a relationship, not necessarily just death, although of course death is a type of loss. So the DSM-5, as a reminder, defines these different types of grief. And really, so Weissman asserts that life losses that are not due to death are actually role transitions, whereas in IPT, for eating disorders, grief has been conceptualized as the loss of a major relationship, or even an important aspect of one's identity. And if you've ever worked with, let's say, a partner in a law firm for 45 years who retires, it is absolutely grief when the whole thing that person has spent 80 hours a week doing for 40 years is gone. So, yeah, that matters. Or when a parent who has been a stay-at-home parent of, let's say, a kid with high anxiety needs, suddenly is no longer, the kid goes off and goes to college or something, there's a loss. So I think it's reasonable to conceptualize it that way. So what do you actually do? So you relate the patient's symptom experience to the grief, right, to the loss. So, you noticed an increase in binge eating once you left the law firm. That's relating it to the trigger of grief. That's probably, if you go back to that model, if you think about it, going up to the top, that grief is related to social evaluation. That person derived their sense of value, sense of self, sense of self-esteem based on their position in that law firm. Now the law firm is gone. The person is struggling to figure out, who am I? What am I? What's my value in this world? And probably there's some other relationships that have a little work to do along the way in that case, because you don't have an identity like that about career and then lose it and not have an impact on your marriage, for example. You help the patient to facilitate mourning and emotions. So you teach the patient that emotions can be powerful without being dangerous. You can experience intense grief and sadness without being depressed, or even without binging. That you can go through these experiences here with me and be okay. If it's about death, you can help the patient sort of reconstruct the relationship, tell you about it. I've had one grief therapist describe it as everybody has a grief story. They have a story that they have to sort of tell and tell and tell, and that's their way of processing, and that made total sense to me. So you sort of help the patient do that. You help the patient reconstruct what that relationship meant to them. Maybe they reconstruct pieces of the experience of the loss itself. That's really normal, and that's okay. This is, again, tell the grief story, and then let's explore the associated feelings, both positive and negative, around this loss. So let's not assume that the death of a parent is only a negative thing. You have no idea necessarily what the positive pieces of that might be to the patient, and assuming that it's all negative sort of reconfirms for the patient that it's not okay to maybe feel relieved. People feel really guilty about feeling positive about a loss, and if we open it up that it's pretty normal to have a variety of feelings around grief, then I think it helps open the opportunity for them to experience that full range of emotions. And then, after you've sort of done that piece of the work, then our job is to help the patient consider ways of being involved. After sort of reestablishing interests, relationships, basically finding a new meaning, finding a new purpose. So there's that really weird limbo time for the person who retires from this huge job. What are you going to do now, right? You have to reestablish your new life. What does it look like? I'm going to read to you one of my de-identified cases. This is Jay, or Jim, who we were seeing earlier. So bear with me, it's a little bit long, but I think it's a nice example. So Jim is a 34-year-old man who came to me one morning in the fall of 2018 saying, I need help to lose weight, I just can't do it by myself. I've tried everything, nothing works. I'm getting married in 9 months, and I want to look good in my wedding photos. I can't bear the idea of looking at myself in these photos. I know that the diet won't work for me. I know it's all in my head. my fiance has more willpower than I do, and she's trying to help me, but I just can't stick to any plan. So during our intake assessment, so he comes to me for weight loss. During our intake assessment, it becomes really clear that Jim meets full criteria for binge eating disorder. And he's experiencing several binges per week, usually in his car on the way home from work, while stopping at a drive-thru before getting home to eat dinner with his fiance at the time. He'd sometimes eat things like 3 or 4 burgers plus a milkshake in the car, making sure very carefully to sort of discard the trash before getting home so that his fiance won't notice it. He has these mints that he uses to hide the smell of the grease on his breath, the whole thing. If you've ever worked with binge eating disorder, believe me, this is familiar to you. So during the first work in our sessions, we create this interpersonal inventory, and it becomes clear that Jim had experienced a number of highly important interpersonal issues that would link to his binge eating. So first, his father walked out on the family when Jim was age 7, and his brother was like 4 or 5 at the time. And this is always challenging anyway, but in particular in this case, literally the dad just like left. There was no pre-warning, no precursor, no discussion. He just wasn't there one day, and the mom said Dad left, and like that was it. So a major loss. And he was then suddenly promoted to man of the house, right around age 7, 8, something like that. And his mother, who had been a stay-at-home mom with the 2 boys, had to go get a job because suddenly the dad, who had been working, left the family, and they had no money. So that meant that Jim had been suddenly put in charge of his younger brother. He was responsible for things like making after-school snack for his brother every day, then doing his own homework before dinner while watching over his brother. His mom was doing the best she could at the time and would often stock the house with high-sugar, high-fat foods. And years later, during our sessions, Jim would sort of have this like aha moment that, oh, right, she probably felt horribly guilty about the fact that I was in this role, and she was trying to make it as easy for me as possible by providing food that my brother would actually easily eat, and would sort of feel like a reward, would feel good to us, but of course not healthful at all, and were really risky for waking and for developing sort of binge eating. At the time, though, when he was young, he recalls experience what he calls near euphoria, when his mom would arrive home after the grocery store with a stockpile of what he now calls sugary carbs. So he just remembers sort of it being like a moment in the week, every week, when his mom would bring these foods home, and he sort of knew that that was going to sustain them for the week, and his brother. So during one session early in our work, he was describing the first binge episode he could recall, and he was using really intimate detail to recount how he would turn on the television, like him and his brother would get home from school, he would turn on the television to cartoons for his brother, and his brother would go sit there, and then he would go into the kitchen and carefully portion out snacks for both he and his brother on these plates, and then pour them each a cup of milk. So he'd have 2 cups of milk and 2 plates of snacks. And then when he was certain that his brother was engrossed in the show, he would stay in the kitchen and sort of like get ready for the binge. Then he would take the snacks into the living room with his brother, eat their snacks together, and then under the guise of cleaning up the snack, while his brother was still watching TV, he would take the 2 plates and the 2 empty cups and go back into the kitchen and proceed to eat 4, 5, 6 servings of whatever food was there. He knew his brother wouldn't notice, his brother was content and had his snack, was watching TV, and he could sort of eat without being seen in the kitchen. He said he remembers standing over the kitchen sink and opening wrappers really carefully so that the brother wouldn't necessarily hear the sound of the plastic. And he said he remembers even putting it under his shirt so that when he tore open a plastic thing, it wouldn't make a sound. And part of his prepping for the binge before he took the snack out was like pre-opening things so that he knew that it wouldn't trigger his brother's alert. He reports experiencing a combination of feeling happy and excited, but also guilty and nervous that he'd be discovered by his brother at any moment. He knew his mom wasn't around, but he was worried that at any moment his younger brother would jump up and come in the room, but it was sort of this like agitated, exhilarated time. and he would hide the food wrappers underneath in the trash can, so like dig through and put the wrappers way down under and then put the other trash on top so that people wouldn't see it. And in our sessions, he would wonder aloud how his mom, who was like counting pennies, would never notice that they went through the food so quickly. And he sort of doesn't really understand that unless he just thinks his mom was just so overwhelmed by her life that she just sort of knew that it was happening and didn't think there was anything she could do about it, so wasn't going to call attention to it, was just sort of trying to make it. So he remembers that the binges starting really early would leave him feeling stuffed and often nauseous, but then he would feel pressure to eat dinner when his mom came home because he didn't want his mom to think that he had been binging. So she would serve him their dinner if she got home in time to do that, and so she wouldn't worry about it. So in our sessions, he would tear up at the idea of how much suffering both he and his mom were experiencing during that time, sort of in parallel process, but they had never talked about it because he was aware that something was going on with my mom too, right? She had just had this major life thing and she had no one to talk to, and he would be so sad and thinking about how his mom had also experienced this. Of course, and then he started to wonder aloud if his mom had binge eating as well. She had struggled with her weight and had done crash diets over the years. And so as his weight continued to climb and his binges continued to escalate, when he got his driver's license at age 16, along with his first real paying job, he was suddenly free to stop for drive-thrus and other things after school. So his binge eating sort of escalated, and his mood started to decline, his weight started to escalate. His mom would send him out for errands on an afternoon, and he would stop at a drive-thru, sometimes more than one time, just out being for the afternoon, multiple drive-thrus. And he would drive through alternate restaurants so that he would be recognized by the person working the drive-thru. So very thoughtful about hiding this behavior. So he would describe this period of his adolescence as very stressful and very sad. His family was struggling financially, and Jim had suddenly been thrust into a caregiver role. So clearly he had a lot of role transitions. Clearly he had role disputes. But the interesting part is that he really was experiencing grief that he had never been able to resolve. Right? His father literally disappeared from his life, and he had never been spoken to about it. I mean, his mom didn't know how to handle it herself. She certainly couldn't help him process it. He actually said, I sort of wondered if I was ever gonna have to talk about my dad in therapy. And so it was sort of he was like trying to make light of the fact that he knew this was a big deal in his life, but he had never really processed it.
Well, he actually loved both.
He absolutely did. He absolutely did. He also lost his child in a lot of ways. So because I'd like to give you an example of what it's like in real clinical practice, where this went was, as we're continuing to review the current interpersonal functioning, the picture becomes even more complex. Him and his fiancée had known each other for many, many years before they got engaged. Their families were friends. And they got engaged just a few months before treatment started. And I think I had it a little bit wrong on that. And their relationship had a lot of positive aspects about it. But there were several disputes that were also triggering for Jim's binge episodes. So he described it to me, and again, this is de-identified change a little, but I did this is him talking. I did this protein-based, very low-calorie diet or something for like 6 months last year, and I felt amazing while I was doing it. I ate a protein shake for breakfast and for lunch. I had a big salad for dinner every night for those full 6 months. I declined invitations to eat dinner out, and I even skipped work happy hours because I was like on this plan. And I was losing weight rapidly. Like I lost 7 pounds a week sometimes. I lost over 75 pounds on this plan in like 6 months. It was magic. The weight fell off. I was on top of the world. I felt amazing. I felt like nothing could stop me. I couldn't believe how I used to eat so much food at once. That behavior felt a million miles away. Felt like I would never go back there. So, of course, I sort of knew that I couldn't eat this way of just protein shakes forever, and I had thought a lot about how I would eat when I stopped this diet. And so I decided that I'd stop the diet on my birthday last year. And to celebrate my birthday and my weight loss success, My fiance and I decided to go out to a nice dinner. I ate very reasonably that night. I said no to the complimentary bread basket, which is always my weakness. I felt great when I left the restaurant. On the car ride home, Lucy, his pretend fiance, said, "Why did you get the steak instead of the fish? I thought you were going to actually try to keep the weight off that you just lost." She had consumed a few glasses of wine that night, so I sort of assumed she didn't mean it. But the next morning, however, she actually asked me the same question again. I got angry, but I didn't tell her. Because in a lot of ways, she's right. I should have had the fish. I just felt like I'd done such a great job these past 6 months, and I said no to the bread basket. It was my birthday. I had done such a good job. But when I left that afternoon to go pick up her dry cleaning, it was like I went into autopilot. I drove through McDonald's, just like I've always done. I ordered 2 Big Macs, a supersized fry, a large chocolate shake, and I ate it in the car in the parking lot without even tasting it. As I was sitting there, the warmth of the sun coming through the car windows, I was basically shut off. I finished the food in under 10 minutes, and then I drove to the dry cleaner. And on the way home from the cleaners, I passed through a Dunkin' Donuts and realized I hadn't had any sweet finish to the meal, even though I just had a milkshake. I told myself it didn't count, so I got a large coffee culotte and 3 glazed donuts. And after I finished all of that, I actually realized, oh wait, I did just drink a full chocolate milkshake. It was so weird, it was like it hadn't happened, except of course about 20 minutes later, I was feeling really sick to my stomach. And I actually had to stop at the grocery store on the way to use the bathroom because I was afraid I'd be I guess my body wasn't used to that sort of food after 6 months. So that's just a sample of what the conversation was like and how he was reporting the story to me. Later, what we did is really allowed him, I identified for him that there were several things going on. That I saw grief over his loss of his parent, his dad, as a major initial trigger to the binges that he had experienced. And I asked if he was willing to start to process that grief a little bit differently. And he absolutely was, saying, I sort of wondered if at some point I was going to have to talk about my dad in therapy. And then I said, but there's obviously also a lot of disputes going on with your fiance, and they happen to be about eating and weight. So that's going to be something that we're going to have to talk about, how to communicate to her. And so the grief part of it was just a few sessions, and he sobbed, just full-on sobs for, I don't know, 30 minutes of every session for the next 3 or 4 weeks. Just sobbed. And it was just about his loss and about his dad and about the responsibility he felt, really processing that grief. I mean, he really mourned. And it was the first time he'd ever done that. Side note, his dad is sort of back in the picture very sporadically. And one of the things in maintenance treatment that we've done is work on how to handle that relationship. But I'm telling you, just those couple sessions where we validated his loss and let him express really intense grief was immensely healing. He noticed a decrease in his binge eating, really almost immediately. I did a lot of connecting, and we did the timeline. It was like blatantly obvious that he had started this binge eating behavior pretty much right after his dad left. So it was not a hard sell for him to see that this grief experience was the initial trigger, and that if we went back through it, that we might get a little bit of resolution, but that it wasn't alone, that we had to work on the role dispute with his fiance as well. But in that moment, he was decreasing his binge eating significantly. So that's an example where, like, it would be really easy to jump straight on the fiance because it's complicated and there's clearly role disputes. But I think that especially if you're going to treat grief, it should probably come first, because it's sort of a mourning process, right? You experience it, you mourn it, and then there's a resolution. So that's a little bit different than a role dispute, which might go on and on. If there's going to be grief, it's usually indicated to treat that first. If that's going to be one of the identified problem areas you treat, go with it, treat it first, and then move on. But talk transparently with your patient about what you're doing.
I guess I'm just a little confused. So in the beginning you had said that you don't really look at past relationships. And I mean, obviously grief is different
That's
in
it.
some ways, but you don't do that, but we're doing that here, so.
Grief is a little bit, different because it's sort of a, I don't know another way to say it other than it's like a bell curve. You know, like if in an IPT framework, now in other frameworks you could process the grief and the loss of his dad for ongoing, right? And there's room for that too. But from an IPT perspective, we would really be processing the grief as something you can work through, express, experience from an affective component, and there's a resolution to that. People feel better. And if you've seen that as a trigger to binge eating, then we sort of go through it, but again, usually not in isolation. Usually it's co-occurring with something else, like in this case, a role dispute. So we don't spend a lot of time rehashing old relationships. It's not like we were talking about how he used to communicate with his dad or the disputes he had with his dad. We were really processing the loss because the loss was still very present, right? So then when we're doing the role dispute, then we're like in the here and now. What did she say? How did you respond?
Right, you're not doing a role dispute from 10 years ago.
Exactly. We're processing the loss. Interpersonal deficits. This is the problem area when there's no clear acute interpersonal event associated with the onset or maintenance of the disorder. And the individual describes a recent history of impoverished or contentious interpersonal relationships. So, although many patients seeking IPT treatment, particularly people with binge eating disorder and bulimia nervosa, tend to have higher, if we look across different types of disorders, there's a higher incident of interpersonal deficits reported in research studies of interpersonal deficits among people who present with bulimia nervosa and particularly binge eating disorder. But really IPT is sort of seen as the like none of the above category. So if there's not an apparent loss, if there isn't a major role transition, and if there aren't major interpersonal disputes, then we would really be falling back on, is there a paucity of relationships here? Is something missing in this person's life? And again, that's why I like to use the closeness circle even with adults, because you get a sense of that just by looking at the picture, potentially. Not always, because what some people define as close relationships or important relationships isn't the same as what I might define for that person as an important relationship, but you do generally get a sense. Now, this again, I've talked about IPT is not an ideal treatment if there's a person who just doesn't have attachments or doesn't want attachments, but really, if they have a lot of unfulfilling relationships. So, for example, people can say that they're really like popular at work or have are really successful at work, but have like nothing else in their life except work, and don't even have particularly close relationships with the people they work with. It's their success is determined by their productivity, for example, or their billing hours or something like that. But you sort of keep questioning, like, what are they doing on the weekend? What are they doing in the one spare night they have a week? Or who would they invite to a birthday celebration? And there's nobody. That doesn't matter if they're a successful partner in a law firm. We would still be thinking about it from an interpersonal deficits perspective. Does that make sense, the differentiation? So keep in mind that people who have chronic depression, dysthymia, other things, that can of course impact their relationships. So that is something to consider and to highlight for them. Same with eating disorders. Again, because we've talked about eating disorders are often done in hiding, in secret, in isolation. So by nature, people are spending more time alone if they're engaging in really intense eating disorder behavior. And that results in fewer relationships. And then, of course, social anxiety disorder, which we spoke about. So what do you actually do? So you relate the symptoms of the social isolation, relate the symptoms of the eating disorder to the social isolation. And I don't ever use the word interpersonal deficits because, like, why? I say loneliness, isolation, wanting more closeness than you have, those sorts of terms. So I hope you will consider doing the same. When applied specifically to eating disorders, interpersonal deficits may be due to a patient's tendency to limit relationships to superficial ones. They might, patients will literally say, like, food is my best friend. Food is the one that's there for me no matter what I feel. Food is the one that's not going to judge me. And so if that's how that person relates to food, then you can understand how they're going to have limited relationships outside of food. And our job is to both review, I think someone earlier said, like, has there ever been a time when your circle was different? I love that, right? It's a nice way of saying, have there been times, maybe before you started binge eating, as frequently when you had closer relationships, and then something started to happen and your relationship started to fall away, and then you started picking up on the binge eating, and then that has circled back and really affected you because you're more isolated. But, so you sort of want to gauge, does the person have relationship skills? And then we want to explore repetitive patterns. So do they keep people at a distance? Do they not get close to people? And then discuss how the patient's positive and negative feelings about the therapist might parallel other relationships. So you can be open about that. Here's an example. And I think I use this a little bit later, but I'll share part of it now. So as many of you probably have experienced in your own life, being a working parent is complicated. And so an unexpected childcare need meant that I had to cancel a whole day of private practice patients. When that happened, the next session, one of my patients with interpersonal deficits was totally shut down. And you can probably guess where that was going. She had internalized that cancellation as a reaction to something she had said in the last session or something like that. So that's an example of how, and she didn't say to me, without me doing a lot of work, that was happening. She was just quiet, withdrawn, late. So if you imagine that happening in other relationships where the other person's job isn't to identify what's going on, they just walk away. And so we were able to talk about, you had a negative feeling, and what happened is you withdrew, and that is probably happening in other relationships too. So that's an example of how I might use what's happening in the session to talk about other relationships. So some questions you might ask are, how often do you see friends? What do you enjoy about being with them? If they can't answer that, that's your red flag. Do you sometimes feel uncomfortable around other people? And then I would say, if you ever feel uncomfortable in here with me during session, I encourage you to talk to me about it. This is the very type of thing we can be helping you with so that you can then use this out in your own life. So I'll read a little sample from the Weissman book about a rule dispute, interpersonal deficit. It's a pretty short one. So the case example is called I Can't Make Friends. If you have this book, it's page 77. Diane, a 23-year-old single woman, had never been socially comfortable, but she had managed to fit in and make the best of it with friends she'd known for years in high school, while living in a single-sex dormitory in college and in planned school activities. She had avoided dating in high school. Now she was on her own, and the year since she graduated from college, she had found her first job and gotten her own apartment, yet she felt at a loss. Even though Diane had a good job that she had planned and studied for, she couldn't deal with her discomfort around men. She didn't know how to talk to them, how to develop friendships, or how to extricate herself from relationships that were uncomfortable, or how to avoid sexual involvement with them. She spent most of her time after work alone in her apartment. Her attempts to develop new friendships were often disastrous. She went to a dance and became sexually involved with someone she hardly knew or liked. She described herself as bored and lonely. She'd lost weight, she was having trouble sleeping, and had missed several days at work. Her therapist defined her problem area as major depression related to role deficits in social skills. Therapy began with a detailed discussion of her daily activities, how Diane spent each day at work, her evenings, and the weekends. The therapist and patient also reviewed how her college relationships had developed since she graduated, finding a clear pattern of increasing withdrawal after her first unsuccessful effort to find friends when she moved out of town. She felt shy, unattractive, and awkward, and didn't know how to start a conversation or how to set boundaries in a relationship. On the positive side, Diane was a reasonably good athlete and had excelled in swimming in college, where she had had one best friend. The therapist encouraged her to act on her own idea to invite that friend for a weekend visit, and then to gradually increase her social activities with one other potentially trusted friend. Therapy included discussions of these opportunities and her anxieties, and role play with the therapist. For example, planning the weekend with friend, approaching people at the swimming club she'd joined, warding off a premature or unwanted sexual advance from a male acquaintance. Diane made progress. By the end of therapy, her depressive symptoms had decreased from a moderate to mild range, and she had bolstered her relationships with women friends and had successfully turned aside one unwanted man advance. She had yet, however, to begin dating comfortably or seriously. Patient and therapist agreed to a one-year maintenance course of monthly IPT to build further on the gains she had made acute. So she goes on to say that although what Diane fit was interpersonal deficits, you could have also potentially seen this as a role transition, namely the transition out of college and into adulthood. A key aspect of the shift would have been the need to adjust her social relationships. This might have been a more palliative formulation for the client. However, it seemed like her long-standing issue was in developing close relationships, so they just dove in and went for it. So that's one. There's several case examples in here if you want to look at it. I'm not going to spend as much time on the life goals because, again, it's just not quite as well established, but we know that late adolescence and early adulthood are critical times for career, lifestyle, relationship, place of living, and that these processes all often get stalled or never get started, particularly if someone has depression or an intense eating disorder, because of the disorder's pervasive influence. And so patients report feeling at sea in terms of their goals and aspirations. And it seems broader than transition. So like they're really struggling across lots of different life goal domains. What you would do with a patient from an IPT for eating disorder perspective would be to help them consider their life aspirations, develop a plan to take steps toward meeting some of those goals and aspirations, make necessary changes in his or her life to support meeting their life goals. So for example, I want to go back to school to get my master's degree, but I live in, whatever, a town where there's no graduate program really available. So you might start exploring with them, what would you like to relocate and be closer to the school that you've been really wanting to go to, things like that. And so typically this problem area is addressed only when another problem area that has been resolved, which allows the patient to begin to think about his or her future. In other words, usually a patient that has life goal problems also has other relationship problems that are acutely triggering the eating disorder symptoms. And you might start there because these life goal issues are more chronic in nature, as you can imagine. It's not like one or two conversations is going to make a meaningful difference. It's going to be a long, ongoing process. So I'm going to answer a few questions. So this one is, what if I don't know what the problem area is? Just 3 minutes.
Therapists or counselors who are not very familiar with IPT will oftentimes be hesitant on identifying a particular problem area. And it's really important to do that because it really frames the treatment. But sometimes individuals may like, well, I don't know if it's a role dispute, I don't know if it's a transition, and so they don't really focus. And that, I think that can be a real problem because it really prevents people from, again, identifying the problem area that then sets the stage for the remainder of the treatment. So it's really important to do that. My advice to clinicians, if they're not sure, it's kind of like, well, place your bets. It's like you put your chips on, like red or black, and then go with it. And then if you're, in the middle of your treatment, or like, the early part of the middle phase, and you realize like, gosh, I don't, actually now that I've got more information, I really think it's this. Then you go with that, because in many respects, many of the strategies, there's a good overlap, so it's not that problematic. In fact, one of the individuals that I worked with when we were first piloting the shorter term treatment, very similar issue. I thought initially it was an interpersonal deficit, but as we got going, it was really clear that this woman had a role dispute with her mother. And so in the middle of treatment, it was like I had this aha moment that, you know what, I think we've been talking about some of the social things that you've been addressing, but really, as you've talked about it, I think there's been a lot of things going on with your mom. And it was like we really connected there, and actually it really pushed the treatment forward. So it was information that came out in the context of treatment, so we just made it an adjustment and moved on. But I think it's better to do that than to go into it with feeling fuzzy. Some clinicians, based on their training, might be disinclined to push people or to get them focused. A lot of therapists, and myself included, clinicians, we've been trained to start a session off by saying, like, what do you want to talk about today? Or what would you like to do today? Or, or more just globally, well, how was the week for you? And then what happens is once the client gets going, then we're hesitant to stop them and move them in another direction. So it's much better to maintain a focus and focus on the connection between the symptoms and the problem area, because then it keeps you on track. Because one of the, again, hallmarks of IPT is that it is a short-term treatment. And if you're, especially for individuals like counselors or individuals in counseling centers who have like anywhere from 6 to 10 sessions, you don't really have that many opportunities to allow the client to take you in another direction, because time is not your ally often, and so you have to really maintain a good focus.
And next, just another quick 2-minute video, 2.5 minute, about what to do if you have more than one identified problem area.
The identification of more than one problem area is really common in IPT. Many people in the IPT world like to think of it in terms of this idea of triage. What is the problem area that's most amenable to change, and addressing that first? Clearly you can have more, but yet clearly you can have more than one problem area. So for example, it's not uncommon for an individual to have a role dispute, but also to have a bit of an interpersonal deficit. And also too, it's not uncommon to have, for example, a role transition along with perhaps a role dispute. So you can see, like, if a wife moves a family for a job, right? And so then the family goes, but then the husband isn't able to find a job, for example, and it creates conflict, within the context of the family. You can see then, okay, you have a role transition, and you have a role dispute. So in many respects, you could be talking about two problem areas. The issue with that is, though, that clearly both problem areas need to be linked to the onset and maintenance of the current disorder. And if they are, you can clearly see either an exacerbation of symptoms as a result of, like, the conflict that may, for example, let's say you have a role transition. Okay, you move from one city to another, and the individual starts, getting more depressed, or they start turning food. Then they are aware that they have, let's say, a marital dispute with the husband. And in the context of the dispute, the disorder gets worse. So it actually exacerbates, so you've already begun an eating disorder or problematic eating or depression, and then the onset of the marital dispute intensifies or magnifies the symptom. Then I think that you can link those two and say that you've got two problem areas. And then in treatment, of course, you would say, okay, what's most amenable to change? So probably in this particular instance, you would think about the transition, because moving is something you can connect in with, trying to establish a new social network, establish new friendships. Think about what was it like in your old neighborhood, then you've got a new neighborhood, you try to reconnect, and like find out where the store is, where do I go for this, where do I go for that. Sometimes for people it can be quite overwhelming. And then that might be probably more amenable to change, and then you would start working on the dispute. Some could argue, though, that working on the transition would also, in many respects, kind of soften and perhaps allow the dispute to be more workable and amenable to change.
Does that then extend treatment, or how do you manage that within the 20 sessions or whatever number you have?
So sometimes, like in grief, for example, it's usually only a few sessions, and then you have the remaining sessions to talk about the other role dispute or whatever's going on. If it's two big ones, like role transitions and role disputes, then you would explicitly say, like, we're gonna work on, you know, X, which seems to be the most amenable to change, and then at the end of the treatment, if you say, like, we still have work to do, then you would contract for maintenance treatment, or sort of go back and say, you know, explicitly, we're gonna work on X problem. Remember in the termination phase, when you start transitioning, you sort of outline, in the remaining sessions, we have this to work on. That might be a time also to say, you know, we've spent a lot of time talking about role disputes, there is this transition. Maybe we can use the next 5 sessions to talk more about using the skills around role transition. And because you've already done things like communication analysis and role playing, the patient's more familiar and on board with what that looks like anyway. So I think if you've done a good job laying the foundation for the tools you're going to use and how the patient is supposed to use the tools outside of treatment, then treating a second problem area, in my experience, is faster. People get it quickly, and they get, oh, okay, right, I'm supposed to pay attention to that, I'm supposed to come in and talk about this. So, but you can certainly contract for more treatment.
Would you ever bring it up to the client to have them choose, like providing informed information, like you identify this, like transition, this role dispute, which is affecting me more, or would you?
I would, absolutely.
Like, collaborative about it?
Absolutely, especially if you're able to link it to the eating disorder behavior. You know, which of these feels like a more salient trigger for your patients? You know, if we go down treating this road, does that one feel more meaningful to you? And usually patients can tell you. So, okay, so we have a half an hour left. I'm going to be very IPT and collaborative and ask you what you'd like to do at that time. I have 2 ideas. So, as you'll see from your slide handouts, I only have like 4 slides left for today, so that was pretty good timing. One of them, I have a video that's about, back to the postpartum example, that's about 7 or 8 minutes, reviewing what it looks like to do an interpersonal inventory and a closeness circle with her, so in session. I'd like to sort of do a wrap up for all the big stuff we've covered today. And then I also have a case, just a little bit of a case outline here for Rachel, who's a 48-year-old woman. And I could certainly just read her case, and then you guys could practice together. One of you takes the role of the patient, one of you takes the role of the therapist, and practice just creating a closeness circle. Practice started doing this psychosocial assessment, the interpersonal inventory. We're going to do more of that tomorrow, but it depends on your energy level. I know it's hard at 4:30 to kind of gin up the energy for something like that. Alternatively, it might feel better than watching another video. So what feels right to you guys? Any have a strong opinion? Everybody's afraid to speak up.
I like the postpartum wrap-up, kind of to set up things, because we learn so much today. The sound turned up more.
I don't think the sound, I don't know. Do you know how to turn the sound up? No? That's a funny freeze frame. I tried to
We get a deeper level, a deeper connection, and got a lot more valuable information than simply asking a checklist of questions. next segment, I'll be conducting an interpersonal inventory with the patient.
Oh, it does.
Before reviewing that, what I'd like to do is briefly review with you the structure of IPT. As you can see, there are 4 different segments of IPT. The assessment or initial sessions, those might last anywhere from 1 to 3 sessions, depending on the complexity of the case. The middle section of IPT, in which specific problem areas are addressed. And then the conclusion of IPT. That's followed by maintenance, and it's critical in IPT to recognize that there isn't a termination. We're obligated, I think, based on the data that we have, and certainly clinical experience, to provide some kind of maintenance treatment. So rather than terminating, it's a conclusion. The acute phase is ended, but we're continuing to provide some maintenance treatment as the patient needs it. It's important in IPT to recognize that this structure is very much like an accordion. In other words, it has a structure to it. These things have to be done in order, but they're all flexible. And what that means is there is not a set number of sessions for each one. The assessment may take a session or 2 with more complex patients, say. The middle sessions may take less than 8 sessions if the problem area is restricted or if the case is relatively straightforward. Sometimes it takes more than that. And the conclusion phase may take more than 2 sessions if you have somebody who's a little bit more dependent and you want to taper off sessions. So I think it's important to recognize there's a lot of flexibility in IPT, and by no means is there a dictate that you have to do 12 sessions or 16 sessions or any number of sessions with every single patient. That simply doesn't make a clinical sense, it's not supported by the research, and it doesn't make sense in terms of the complexity and variety of patients that we see. So it should be structured but flexible. IPT also focuses on 3 problem areas, as I mentioned before. Those are usually addressed during the assessment phase and also obviously during the middle phase when you'd be addressing the specific problems. Those 3 problems, grief and loss issues, interpersonal disputes, and role transitions, really describe a lot of human experience. In this particular case, as with many perinatal women that we see, this woman's particular issues involve interpersonal disputes and role transitions, literally conflict with her husband, and also having some difficulty making the transition to having a baby. And that'll be the focus of much of the treatment.
So just pausing to remind you, this is where those discrepancies in number of problem areas shows up. So in IPT for eating disorders, 4, potentially 5. Okay, so disputes, transitions, deficits, life goals, and grief. Okay.
During the initial phase of IPT, one of the critical elements is the conduct of an interpersonal inventory. And what that is, basically, is simply a picture of the forest. In other words, what I'm interested in when I do it is what the patient's social support looks like, globally speaking. One way of doing that, and we found it to be an amazingly effective tool, and it's quite simple as well, is to use what we've called here a circle of relationships, or an interpersonal circle, or whatever you want to call it. It can be very simple. You can certainly pick out a piece of notebook paper and draw circles on it if you like. You can use squares instead of circles. You can use 4 circles instead of 3 if you want. But in essence, simply to take out a piece of paper to draw circles on it, and typically I would then give it to the patient and say, what I'd like you to do is to put the names of 7 or 8 people that you're close to on this circle. And I'd like you to place them depending on how close you feel to them. They should be people that are relevant to the problem that you're having that brought you into therapy. And what I'd like you to do is simply to write the names and tell me who they are. So if you write down Todd, for example, you tell me that it's your husband or your father and so forth, so I know who those individuals are. We'll go back and get some more information about them as we go. I also give the patient some information about the circle itself. The patient should be in the middle. The inner circle is people that are more intimate in relationship to them. Close supports would be in the next circle, and then extended supports. You can use different terms if those work better for you. But the critical thing is to give control to the patient and let them place people on the circle as they see fit. If you do that, you'll find some amazing things happening. The first one is that it generates some thought on the part of the patient in a very different way about where those people should go. And many, many clients, patients that we've worked with have said that they have gotten a lot of insight about their relationships, and it's generated some thought about why, for example, a mother is placed in a farther circle when there's a desire to have her closer. You can also use it somewhat as a projective test, almost like family modeling, because if you allow the patient to put the names on the circle, I think you'll find oftentimes they clump people together. So perhaps a small family group here with somebody else outline. The other thing that many people have done is to start drawing arrows. So for instance, they might draw their husband as an extended support because there's a conflict with an arrow in, a wish that he would be in closer. Or some other family member might be with an arrow out because they're creating conflict and are too close. I've had people draw in pets, I've had people draw in, and you should certainly ask for people who aren't present, but to write in individuals who might be deceased or dead that are still relevant to the support that they get or the problem area that they're bringing into therapy. But the main thing is it's a very simple, straightforward tool that engages the patient in a very different way. And particularly by allowing them to fill it out, you're inviting them to collaborate, to participate, to think about their relationships. It's a wonderful way to set the stage for the rest of IPT. Once you have those people identified, the next step is simply to ask questions that you're probably already familiar with. Questions like, what do you like about the relationship? What would you like to change? What's a conflict like? What kind of support would you like? And what kind of support are you getting? And even what kind of support do you give those people on the interpersonal circle? And for at least one or two of those individuals, I like to ask the patient to tell me a story. Literally just that, tell me a story. No more directions. And it's amazing the kind of information you get. That kind of opportunity to tell a story, to get the patient thinking in that way about the other individual just a little bit differently, and to produce a narrative is extremely helpful to understand a little bit more about what the relationships are like, what the patient's attachment style is like, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and also to get the patient to start participating, collaborating, and thinking about things in a different way.
Well, let me go back to the marital relationship a bit then. And one of the things that we found really helpful to collect information in a concise way that we can kind of talk about is to use the, I'll just draw it out for you. Interpersonal circle is a fancy term, but what it really amounts to is just a series of circles. I didn't do too well in art class. So essentially the gist of it is that you would be in the middle, and then this would be people in this inner circle who are close to you, people who are not quite so close but supportive, and perhaps social acquaintances.
Okay.
There really isn't any right or wrong way to do this, but this kind of gives us a bird's eye view, if you will, of close personal relationships. And who's in your social support network. So if I could ask you to jot down a few people, and if you wouldn't mind kind of talking it through as you're putting it down, just real briefly, that would be helpful too.
Sure, so this is like my immediate family and friends.
Well, it could be. People that you find supportive. Many people find that's who those people in the inner circle are, but they need not be. If you have some kind of horrible relationship with your mother, she might be clear out here. So.
Well, Tom, my husband, would go in there, and Josephine, and Grace. Yeah, it's like that. And then probably my mom, Lois. I'm less close with my dad, but I love him, and he supports me. So I'll be Doug too. And yeah, then Emily is a good friend of mine.
Okay.
Then I guess, I don't know, I don't really talk to the relatives. And this is like people who are not super intimate, right?
Yeah, correct. Right.
Okay.
Not quite as close. I mean, it's just the distance graphically, if you would describe it.
Sure. Okay, so that would be like Laura, Tanya, Tina. These are friends of mine. Like Emily and I stayed close. She has a daughter, and she's a freelance writer, so we have kind of similar.
Right.
She has not had a second child. And then Laura, Tanya, and Tina were all people that I knew from like work stuff. No kids. I talked to them.
Okay, so those are the folks you were talking about before, you didn't really quite get it.
In the last segment, you saw the conduct of the interpersonal inventory. Here's a picture of the diagram that she came up with, just for your reference.
start, what I'd like to do is get more detail about some specific relationships. So tell me about Todd.
Okay, yeah. We met because we were actually both working part-time at the public library, and you know, we like the same movies and that kind of thing, and so we started dating. And we dated for about 3 years, and we had always planned on getting married. That had been part of it. And then Josephine came along, and we did get married.
I was going to ask about that. 'Cause
Yeah.
She was 5, you've been married 5 years, so
Yeah.
how far along were you when you got
Oh,
married?
I was only 2 months. I mean, we knew, you know. I mean, that had been the plan all along. It was like, oh, well, we might as well just do this now. And it was fine. It was great, you know. And we already had 2 bedrooms, so, I mean, it was, you know, the perfect spot. And then once Josephine was born, you know, I was still working, and Todd got a promotion to manager of the restaurant, so he was able to, and we were able to buy a little house. With another room that we thought would be perfect for, you know, either an office or another child one day. And we just hadn't planned on expanding the family when we did. So.
So how would you describe him?
Oh, he's funny. He's a kind of a big, scruffy guy. He's very smart, and he's just, I don't know how to describe him completely. He's funny and loves food, and he's very friendly and kind and warm, and he's just great. I think he's wonderful. I mean, I don't have any, I love him, you know, but it's just, when it comes to parenting, I think he always wanted kids, you know, and wanted a family and everything, but I mean, the actual parenting of kids is a bummer. And so I think he avoids it as much as he can. Yes.
Conceptually, kids were good.
Really, you know, for anybody, I mean, who wants to change diapers and discipline kids? I mean, that's no fun, but I mean, it's part of the job. You know, but that's not the part that he likes. So
how would you describe the relationship between the two?
Our relationship with people is really good. Like, it's just, you know, Todd and Christy, it's really good. But it's difficult when we get down to brass tacks and talk about practical matters. You know, money and things like that. I feel like I'm a shrew a lot of the time, you know, like I'm telling him, no, you can't have fun. No, you have to be practical. No, you know what I mean? And I wish he wouldn't play on that on me all the time.
What kind of support would you like to get from him that you're not getting from him?
Well, just, you know, an acknowledgement, like, you know, since these are the things we want, these are the plans we have to make. These are the corners we have to cut. You know, these are the compromises, you know, that we are willing to make because we have entered into this deal together, you know? Sometimes it feels like, you know, oh yeah, we'll have this big family and you can have all the fun parts and I'll have all the crap. And I don't know, I mean, I'm probably exaggerating and being unfair. It just feels like I'm doing so much, you know, with the kids, and I don't get any time off. I mean, I don't have any time off. Day, night, I am on call 24/7, and he gets to go to the kitchen, and he gets to hang around with all these younger people who work at the restaurant, you know, who are fun and interesting. A lot of them are in college, and he has these conversations, and I'm like, well, we played with blocks today. You know, we finished our milk today. What?
So I'm going to pause it there. So you can see that he's really trying to get a sense of the dynamics of the relationship. You'll notice that he used the word close. I tend to use the word important. This is treating postpartum depression. That is a different situation than treating eating disorders. So I like to use important because I think of it as what is triggering the eating disorder behavior. So that's where that differentiation comes into play for me. Because if you look back at the girl who was in college with the binge eating, she probably wouldn't have put her roommate as a close support. But her roommate was a trigger to her binge eating, the conflict the two of them had. So I feel like if you use the word close, you run the risk. I mean, patients are smart enough to have some sense of a relationship that's triggering their eating. But again, I like to set them up to sort of identify the connection sooner rather than later, so I like to use the word core.
You also, I think if I heard correctly, refer to them as people who are
Supportive, yeah.
which I noticed was a little different than.
Yeah, again, it's
Someone
not
would be
how I
triggering.
would frame it
Yeah.
in the treatment of eating disorders. It's one of the problems with having to rely on other fields to give examples. From an eating disorder place, I would say important relationships that are related to the eating. And he did keep circling back to the, to the depression or to the transition problem, but again, just a little bit of a different application. The skills of IPT nonetheless are transdiagnostic. So these are sort of like nuances that help you in applying the tools to a different treatment area, a different diagnosis. But in interpersonal formulation, how are you guys feeling? Do you want to sort of circle around to just finishing up this interpersonal formulation piece? Okay, and then we'll just take 2 minutes to wrap up. Okay.
You can see there's a number of people that she's close to. I got quite a bit more information about her husband, Todd, and in the usual assessment would have gone on to get exactly the same kind of information about other people that she's close to and support her as well. What I'd like to show you now is the next segment, which is developing a formulation. And a formulation in very short order is simply an explanation for why the individual is having difficulty, an explanation for why they show up for treatment. IPT is based on a biopsychosocial model. It's particularly important to think about things in that way. A number of colleagues have suggested we should also include culture and spirituality. Those are important elements too, and if you'd like to include a biopsychosocial, cultural, spiritual model, all the better. I think understanding the total patient is very important in IPT. Both of those models are vastly better than the old medical model, which was dispensed of quite some time ago. During the formulation, typically what I like to do is to draw out at least 3, perhaps 4 or 5 boxes, and simply label them biological, psychological, and social. I usually include culture and spirituality in the social boxes. You can include them somewhere else or in their own boxes if you'd like to do that. You certainly need to ask questions about those to understand why the patient's having difficulty and understand the context of the problems they're experiencing. Biological factors would include things like biological illnesses, genetic predisposition or family history, medications the patient might be on. Psychological factors would include things like attachment style, temperament, personality style. Social factors certainly include social context, the information you get from the interpersonal circle, for example, and also cultural and spiritual elements as well, which are extremely important, again, in understanding the context of the problems the patient's experiencing, as well as the opportunities they have to access social support. All of those things, the biopsychosocial, cultural, spiritual elements, all of them come together to form a unique individual who's then faced with a particular crisis, a grief and loss issue, a role transition, or an interpersonal dispute. And because of the severity of that particular problem or problems, they have symptoms. They become distressed. They become depressed or anxious. They have eating problems, oftentimes a combination of all those things. So the biopsychosocial model is a way of understanding why the individual is having trouble. And IPT focuses largely on the psychological elements and social elements, helping people to increase their social support and to get their attachment needs more effectively. As with the interpersonal inventory, it usually works best in IPT to do the biopsychosocial formulation collaboratively with the patient you're working with. And when I do that, typically, again, I'll put the piece of paper on the table or the desk between us and ask for the patient to tell me some of the elements they think go into those various boxes. Most of the time, they give a pretty good explanation, and I can add things that we've discovered throughout the history. For example, if the patient forgets to say something about a family history, or a medical illness that I've already collected information about. But that collaborative process, again, really reinforces the collaborative nature of IPT as a whole. Let's try and put things together, and what I'd like to do is kind of come up with a summary. I'm going to draw something out, and then you can take it home with you, actually, and hang on to it. One of the things that we discovered is helpful in thinking about things, and again, forgive my messy drawing here, is that there are a number of factors that kind of coalesce together, and I think lead people to be thrown off stride for a bit when they're going through a transition, like having a baby or in a conflict, or we also deal with grief and loss issues too, although I don't have a sense that that really is that relevant for this particular situation for you. Those things are biological elements. You described some difficulty with menstrual periods, for example, that might influence the development of postpartum.
Right.
Social factors, psychological factors too. So one of the things we found helpful is to actually have people list out some of those factors so we can kind of begin to understand a little bit about why this has been a bit more difficult for you, and hopefully that will direct some of the treatment as well.
Okay.
So the biological, I think I better let you write it. Let me just write the titles and then I'll let you write the rest of it so you can at least read it. All right. So just so you can read what I wrote there, the biological across the top, psychological and social.
Social. Okay.
The premenstrual symptoms, that's what you put there. What other biological factors do you think might be playing a role here?
Weight gain. I mean, that's a biological factor.
Oh, absolutely. And it's got to just being postpartum too, and worn out, sleep deprivation. I think
Oh,
I'd
I
go
put
there.
that there, sleep. Death. Yeah, I don't know, just exhaustion.
Yeah, and one of the ones that crosses my mind too is I probably put breastfeeding there too. That's not a risk factor for depression by any means, but if you're breastfeeding the whole night, that by definition means you have to get up, and that is one thing your husband can't do. Right. But what psychologically, what kind of things do you put in that box? You mentioned the melted type A.
Yeah, that was from a long time ago. I guess psychologically, I mean, I'm having problems dividing psychological and social because, I mean, for me, I feel like I am not the person that I was with my friends, and that you know, I don't know where to put that, social or psychological.
That's a good question. I think as I'm hearing it, and correct me if I'm off base here, it's kind of a struggle with sense of self, who am I now, especially as you're making that transition.
Very
So
much.
I think actually instead of putting it there, I might put it down in the bottom as one of the issues we need to address.
Okay.
Psychologically, I have a couple of things that you mentioned. One, again, I like the melted type A thing. Somebody who's really organized.
Yeah.
You described a real sense of confidence for the most part in dealing with crises and usually being able to take care of those.
Like stress. I suppose my husband does not like stress.
Good sense of humor in there too, I think.
Oh, well, thanks. Good sense.
Social factors, what kind of things do you find there?
Oh, I guess just, you know, what is my relationship network right now?
Yeah,
Compared to.
a couple of friends you mentioned that you don't have the same kinds of connections
Yeah.
because of change in life.
I'm changing. I don't really want to hang out with them on the meeting set, but I feel like I have to.
Okay. We didn't talk much about religious or spiritual issues. Is that something that plays a role for you at all?
No, we never go to church or anything like that.
Right.
Um,
I also didn't mention proximity to other people too, and I'm thinking your parents in particular, are they from the area?
No, they're back in Illinois.
Whereabouts?
In Winfield, it's a suburb, it's just south of Wheaton.
Okay, then I'll read this, but I'm more interested.
Yeah. And then his parents are in Des Moines, well, just outside there in Altoona. So, yeah. So, I mean, they come over a bit, you know, like usually once every couple of months. but I don't know, I haven't really thought of inviting them to take care of Gracie. She's only 6 weeks old, so.
That's a pretty good start. We can add to that too. The idea basically is all these things kind of coalesce, and typically in therapy we talk about several different problem areas. One of those, as I mentioned, is grief and loss, which doesn't seem to be relevant. We can keep that on the back burner if something like that comes up. The two that you've described that really strike me are role transitions, having another child, which is a big change, and especially the decision about work, and then conflict with your husband too. And I think when people have difficulty in those kinds of areas, they're going through a rough transition, they're having a conflict that's difficult to resolve, it has a big impact on mood, enjoyment, life, stress generally.
Right.
And I have a sense too that from what you described, your typical way of coping is to work harder, to do things.
Yeah. Well,
It's
I
a-
mean, fix things.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is a great strategy most of the time, but sometimes can become an Achilles heel.
Yeah. Well, it feels like, how do you get out from under this? I don't know what the fix is. And I don't like not doing that.
I'd suggest a couple of things that we need to do. One would be to talk a little bit more about your relationship with your husband and see if we can communicate or help you to communicate a little more clearly some of the difficulties and frustrations you're having.
Okay.
Again, I was very impressed with the nonverbal communication from the incident you described, but sometimes that's not real clear to the other person.
I see. Okay.
And then talking a little bit more about finding that sense of self, making it through the transition, perhaps pulling on some of your other social support to do that.
Okay.
One of the very nice things about doing an interpersonal inventory with a patient is it gives you the opportunity to reinforce some of the positive things that they bring to therapy. For example, in this case, I formulated part of her problem as being an Achilles heel, which is a metaphor I like to use quite a bit. In other words, her ability to problem solve, to focus on doing that, to work harder as a way of solving problems, usually works pretty well for her. But in this particular case, with a new baby, just isn't the best way of coping with things. So it allows me to focus on some of the strengths that she brings in, simply framing the problem as a role transition and implying that it's going to be resolved. In addition, the formulation also allows me to add some things like a good sense of humor, and a high degree of intellect, or a lot of insight. And I would encourage you to do that with the patients you're working with as well. And finally, the formulation gives you an opportunity to give an explanation to the patient. And if you've done your job well, you've taken a good history, if you've worked collaboratively with them, you will be able to give them a good explanation, a tentative one, but a pretty good explanation about why they're having problems. And as Jerome Frank wrote many years ago, simply having an explanation for why you're having difficulty is very helpful. It's a key element in getting well. And even better, if you do the formulation really well, it gives you the opportunity to describe why IPT is going to be effective, because it's going to help increase that social support. It's going to help resolve some of those interpersonal problems the patient brings in for treatment. So not only does the formulation provide you an explanation why the patient's having difficulty, but it also directs treatment in a way that's understandable to the patient as well. And that, frankly, is one of the great benefits of IPT. It does not require any sophisticated psychological mechanisms. It's right there. And I can say at the end of the formulation that what we need to focus on, in this case, is the woman's relationship with her husband, drawing in some additional social support, getting some additional help, getting her needs met through this transition.
Okay, so that is a pretty good summary overview of what we've spent all day talking about. And I hope you feel like we've dug into each of those areas. We will start tomorrow with a review very briefly of sort of the structure of IPT, the problem areas, just very quickly. And then we'll move into more case discussions. We'll talk about adaptations of IPT for group and other things. Do some role plays among yourselves at the tables and do some stuff like that. We'll talk about how you test quality of IPT and so forth. Any last minute questions before we, no, just kidding, get out of here? Yes. Okay.